Okay, so this slide show projection here is to look at the reproductive system. Um, so the reproductive system is really about producing the next generation, right? It's about life. So we're going to look first at the male reproductive system and describe the structures, functions of the male reproductive, uh, some hormonal control, really the effects of testosterone, and meiosis. Now, meiosis happens in both men and women, and we will go over that shortly. On the female reproductive side, we're going to list and describe the structures and functions, talk about hormonal control, and then we'll very briefly touch on the breast and lactation, um, which, strictly speaking, should be part of the integumentary system, but most books list it with the reproductive system. Okay, so the primary function of reproductive system in both sexes is to produce gametes. And gametes are the special cells that are haploid. Instead of having 46 chromosomes, they have 23. They have half of each pair of chromosomes. And that's why they're called haploid. Cells that have this are called the gametes. In men, the gamete is sperm. In women, the gamete is ova or oocytes. So the new individual is the merger of the parental gametes, the father's sperm and the mother's ova. Now, after the gametes are made, then the gametes have to be nurtured, they have to be taken care of, right? They have to be transported, and they have to mix, they have to come together. So the organs that produce the gametes are called the gonads. In men, the gonad is the testes. In women, it's the ovary. Right? So the testes and the ovaries are gonads, and they produce gametes, which are sperm and ova. So really, it's about producing sperm on the male side and then keeping the sperm healthy and alive and active until they can be delivered and be deposited in the female reproductive tract. This is all controlled hormonally, and the hormone on the men's side is testosterone, produced by the testes. That's why, and it's a steroid hormone. That's why it's testosterone. On the female side, it's producing the eggs, the ova, right? And the ovaries also secrete estrogen and progesterone. Those are the hormones that control the activity. The female reproductive system not only has to accept the sperm, it arranges for the sperm and ova to meet, and then it has to nurture and protect the fertilized egg for the whole term of pregnancy. So this is the male reproductive structures. There's a YouTube link here if you want it to watch. So we have the testicle down here, which is the gamete, or this is where the gametes are produced. This is also where the testosterone is produced. Now, the sperm that's made ends up moving into this area called the epididymis, where it becomes active and the flagella become active and it learns how to swim. They're transported up here by the vas deferens over and behind the bladder, where the seminal vesicle and the prostate add nutrients for the sperm to leave. It ends up in the urethra and exits through the penis. There's some other accessory things. There is a muscle here in the scrotum called the cremaster muscle, and it's for temperature control. The testy is divided into a whole bunch of lobes and lobules, where there are these things called seminiferous tubules that make the sperm. And between the seminiferous tubules, there are these cells called the interstitial cells, and they make the testosterone. Okay. So the sperm, the gamete, is a very simple cell. The head is a nucleus and not much more. Within the nucleus there are 23 chromosomes instead of the usual 46. So there's one of each pair. Now, surrounding the head is something called the acrosome, and this is got some enzymes that allow the sperm to penetrate the ova during fertilization. Just below the head, there's the body of the sperm, and it contains the mitochondria and the mechanisms that make the flagella move. And then there's the tail, which is the flagellum, which propels the sperm, makes it able to swim. One of the things I want you to notice is that in this sperm cell, there is virtually next to no cytoplasm. There's no inclusions, there's no glycogen, there's not anything, because that would be extra weight to have to move. So the sperm gets its nutrients and its energy from the surrounding environment. So the medium in which it swims is responsible for providing the energy for the mitochondria, the carbohydrates, especially for the mitochondria to make into ATP to drive the flagella. Cool? Okay, so the sperm cells are made in the testes. They exit the testes into this area called the epididymis. And the epididymis secretes the nutrients that keep the sperm healthy and alive and active. They then, over time, as they're being made, they get pushed up the vas deferens, and they wait in this area called the ejaculatory duct. Now, or just before. This is where they mix with the secretions of the seminal vesicle and the prostate, which is here at the bottom of the bladder. And those secretions are the medium in which the sperm live. This provides the nutrients and what's needed for them to live outside the body. All through the vas deferens, the nourishment is provided by the cells of the wall of the vas deferens. So there's 2 testicles, 2 epididymi, 2 vas deferens, 2 ejaculatory ducts, and then the ejaculatory ducts dump into the urethra. The urethra is the tube that's used for the urinary system when you're peeing, and the reproductive system when you are ejaculating. So, most of the ejaculate is the secretions of the accessory glands. The seminal vesicles, there's two of them, join with the vas deferens to form the ejaculatory duct, and then they produce a 60% of the volume of the ejaculate, of the semen. Now, remember, the semen the is not the sperm. The semen is the sperm plus the the secretions of the other glands. The prostate, which is this donut-shaped gland that surrounds the urethra and houses the ejaculatory duct, produces almost 40% of the secretions. So it's involved with the transport medium. Now, there's another little gland right here at the base of the penis called the bulbourethral gland. It's at the bulb of the penis. And it secretes a mucus when there is sexual arousal that clears any lingering urine out of the urethra and is secreted and lubricates the head of the penis in preparation for penetration. The seminal vesicles, the secretions have a lot of citric acid and fructose. So it's really lots of carbs because that's what the mitochondria in the sperm need to produce ATP. So when adequately stimulated, what happens is that the penis engorges with blood. Now, within the penis, there are these three bodies of spongy material. They're called the corpus spongiosum and the corpus cavernosum. And during sexual excitement, which is a parasympathetic response, so stress works against it, but these areas fill with blood and the penis enlarges and becomes stiff because of engorgement of blood. So at this time, we move semen from the ducts into the proximal urethra. All the while arousal is happening, we are moving more and more secretions of the seminal vesicles in the prostate into that prostatic urethra, into that beginning part. When the time is right, we end up with ejaculation, and this is the expulsion of semen from the urethra. Right? This is accompanied with a phenomenon called orgasm. And what this is an autonomic response. It's sympathetic. So parasympathetic nervous system is involved for excitation, but orgasm is a sudden onslaught of sympathetic. Now, the emission is the buildup of the sympathetics. When ejaculation happens, all the skeletal muscle from the base of the penis um, is contracts and causes the expulsion of the semen. Now, because the erection happens because of parasympathetics, orgasm means that the sympathetics have taken over and erection goes away. Right? Yeah, we'll just leave it at that. Okay, the testes produce testosterone. The interstitial cells are the cells that produce the testosterone. Now, their main effect is to cause the development of sperm. Right? So, but then they also cause morphological changes within the body. The primary morphological change is maturation of the sex organs. So the enlargement of the penis and the development of the testes, and basically turning the testes on. This happens at puberty. This massive amount of testosterone that happens at puberty also causes hair growth and hair distribution changes. It causes the larynx to get bigger, and so the voice deepens. The skin thickens, glandular activity increases, and the whole anabolic male physique develops. Bone mass density goes up, more red blood cell production. Right? It affects the brain and increases sex drive, confidence, memory, and mood. Okay, so it's a lot to ask of one hormone, but it happens. At puberty, there is quite a bit of testosterone released, which, as it thickens the skin and increases glandular activity, is why acne is a problem at that time. Right. I want to, something that I said in class, but I want to reassure or say again that vasectomy is cutting the vas deferens, so it's cutting the transport of spermatozoa, from getting to the ejaculatory duct. Because the testosterone is made by the interstitial cells, it's released directly into the blood, and there's no piping necessary. It is completely endocrine. And so testosterone and the effects of testosterone remain unchanged pre and post vasectomy. So the control is really through feedback, positive feedback. Now, the anterior pituitary releases two different hormones: FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. Right? And both of these are released from the pituitary because of a hormone from the hypothalamus in the brain it's called gonadotropin releasing hormone. There's a releasing hormone that tells the pituitary to release FSH and LH. The FSH and LH target the testes. The FSH targets the testes, the seminiferous tubules, to make sperm. So FSH is responsible for the making of the gametes. The LH stimulates the interstitial cells to make testosterone. So luteinizing hormone stimulates hormone production. You're going to see why I'm stressing that in a minute, because it does the same thing in women. So when the testosterone is released, the testosterone also stimulates sperm production, but the testosterone has a negative feedback on the hypothalamus, so there's less releasing hormone released, and it has a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary, and it blocks the release of FSH and LH. So the amount of testosterone controls the amount of testosterone in a negative feedback way, so that we have a homeostatic balance and we have the right amount of testosterone. Cool? Now, one of the things that I noticed that we haven't talked about is the idea of meiosis. The steps of meiosis, well, I will go over it. I'll go over it after this, but the meiosis, unlike mitosis, ends up with the production of haploid gametes. It ends up with half the number of chromosomes in the nucleus. We'll just kind of leave it at that for the moment. Okay, that's pretty much it for the male side. It's we produce the gametes, we control with testosterone, and the testosterone is controlled by this negative feedback. So there is, in most men, the testosterone levels stay pretty constant day after day. Okay, on the female side, it's a little more complicated. So one of the things that happens in men is that sperm are constantly being made. The stem cells undergo mitosis and make more stem cells, and then some of those stem cells undergo meiosis and they make sperm. And this starts at puberty and it goes right until they're nailing the lid on the box. Like it happens constantly. There's constant new gametes being made in men. Women, on the other hand, are born with all the oocytes they will ever have. All of the stem cells that will give rise to gametes undergo mitosis in the fetal ovaries, and they start meiosis 1, and they get stalled at the beginning of meiosis, but there's no more can be made. So after birth, there are no more oocytes being made, which are the gametes, which will become the ova. Right. So each one of these oocytes is sitting in the ovaries, about 1 million per ovary, so about 2 million total. Now, each one of these oocytes, because it's stuck in meiosis, can't do metabolism very well. So they're surrounded by these cells called follicular cells. And the follicular cells is the support cells for this oocyte. Now, during the ovarian cycle, each month, the pituitary gland releases follicle stimulating hormone, and it stimulates the follicular cells to start growing and to mature. And so the maturing follicle gets bigger and it produces estrogen. Now, what's happening is the FSH causes the follicular cells to start to undergo mitosis. So you get more and more of them. And they're producing estrogen. So the amount of estrogen goes up and up and up. And the amount of estrogen then inhibits the release of any more FSH with negative feedback. So at any given month, there's only a few of these follicles have been stimulated enough to start this process. Now, so these oocytes still have these primordial follicles, these primary oocytes, still have 46 chromosomes in them because they've only just started meiosis and they've stopped in prophase 1. So they've stopped early and they haven't finished to become 23. The estrogen is what causes them to finish meiosis 1 and then meiosis 2 to end up with 23. Right? All the while, the follicle is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so we call the follicle that hasn't been stimulated a primordial follicle. Then they become a primary follicle. And then they get so big that the follicle cells that are producing all this estrogen, the name gets changed to granulosum. And when the oocyte has finished the first part of meiosis, meiosis 1, and gets to 23 chromosomes, we now call the follicle the secondary follicle. Now, it's going to continue to grow, and the egg is going to continue to mature, and it's going to almost finish meiosis 2. Now, the follicle is getting really, really big, and all of the cells, the granulosa cells, are not only secreting estrogen, but they're secreting liquids. And there's a liquid-filled space starts to fill in the follicle. Again, this indicates there's a secondary follicle. But this liquid-filled space gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's like a livid zit. It's like a pimple. And at that point, we call it a Graafian follicle. And it's protruding out the surface of the ovary, right? And the amount of the of estrogen that's being produced gets really, really big. And at a certain level, the estrogen levels get so high at a certain time that the pituitary gland, which has not been releasing FSH or LH because it's been held back by the estrogen, the inhibition stops. And all of the FSH and LH, and especially the LH, that has been not, it's being made, but it's not being secreted for days and days and days, has built up. It all of a sudden it gets all released all at the same time. So there's a huge surge of LH, luteinizing hormone. And when that reaches the follicle, the Graafian follicle, it causes the follicle to burst, and the oocyte is expelled. So we call this ovulation. Now, the luteinizing hormone also then, not only does the egg burst forth and you ovulate, but it causes the granulosa cells to change. And now, as well as producing estrogen, they start producing progestation for pregnancy. And we call what used to be the follicle now becomes the corpus luteum, which means the yellow body. And it's producing all kinds of progesterone as well as estrogen. The egg is sent off and it's going through its travels that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. But and it's being maintained by secretions of the uterus. Any sperm that's in the uterus is also being maintained by secretions in the uterus. If the egg and sperm don't meet, there's no fertilization, the corpus luteum stops secreting and it dies back because as it stops secreting, the as it's secreting, the FSH and LH are inhibited, and so it's not being stimulated anymore by FSH and LH, and the corpus luteum basically dies and becomes the corpus albicans, which is a scar. The FSH and LH drop right down, but so does the estrogen and progesterone. When the estrogen and progesterone drop to a low point, now the pituitary is not being inhibited and it releases FSH again, which starts the whole cycle again with new primordial follicles becoming primary follicles, which will develop into secondary follicles, which will become Graafian follicles, and we'll have ovulation and a new corpus luteum. So this takes about a month. Okay, so it's a cyclical arrangement. Now, if there is fertilization, the fertilized ova being implanted causes hormones to be released that maintain the corpus luteum until the placenta can take over. So no pregnancy, the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans. Okay. Estrogen is the first hormone. It happens in the first half of the cycle. It's being produced by the ovaries. It's being produced by the follicular cells, so it's follicle stimulating hormone, and it's promoting the maturation of the eggs. So just like FSH promotes sperm production, estrogen promotes egg production. Right? It also makes the female secondary sex characteristics. So maturation of the reproductive organs and the breasts, widening of the pelvis. It's in control of menstruation. It's got something to do with growth in the epiphyseal plates, etc. Now, progesterone is released by the corpus luteum, and luteinizing hormones involved with that. So just like in the testes, luteinizing hormone controls hormones. So progesterone and estrogen together maintain the menstrual cycle. Progestation maintains pregnancy. It also makes the breast prepare for lactation. Prolactin is the hormone that makes lactation, but progesterone makes the breast ready to be stimulated by prolactin. Right? Again, estrogen, just like testosterone, is involved with maintaining body temperature and memory and bone growth. So there's anabolic, it regulates heart and liver. So it has a lot of different characteristics. Okay. The tract is really pretty simple. The ovaries, which are a separate organ to the rest, are maintained and held in place by ligaments, right? Now there is these tubes that come off the uterus that come over and get very close to the ovaries. And these are called the fallopian tubes. And at the end of the fallopian tubes, there's a funnel with little fingers on the funnel called fimbriae. And they move and they really massage the surface of the ovary, and they have cilia, and so they're pulling fluids, and they create almost a suction. Right? They also have peristalsis in them. So what happens is when the oocyte is ovulated, when the Graafian follicle bursts, when the LH causes ovulation, then the fallopian tube picks up this ovulated oocyte and starts to transport it towards the uterus, down the fallopian tube, from the infundibulum down through the ampulla, and then down to the isthmus, which is just the different parts of the tube. But on either side, they're moving towards the body of the uterus. It's in the fallopian tubes that fertilization happens. So sperm have swum up and they move towards the fallopian tube, and the fallopian tube secretes nourishment for the sperm and nourishment for the egg, and fertilization happens in the tube. The fertilized egg ends up in the body of the uterus, in the lumen. There's a special lining of the uterus called the endometrium. There's a muscular wall called the myometrium, and then on the outside is the perimetrium. Okay? Now, the uterus extends down into the vagina in an area called the cervix. Now, the cervix has two openings, one into the vagina and the other into the uterus itself. And normally there's a lot of mucus producing cells in there that keep that hole plugged. And only at the time of ovulation does that mucus become thin enough to allow sperm to enter. The vagina itself is stratified squamous epithelium. It's the birth canal where the baby goes out, and it's the copulatory organ where the penis goes in. Now, it's very elastic, it's very stretchable, and it has all these ridges in it called rugae that allow the expansion, kind of like an accordion. So we've talked about the cervix, and we've talked about the layers, endometrium, myometrium, and perimetrium. The endometrium responds to the ovarian hormones. So as the hormones are changing in the ovaries, because of the development of the oocyte and directed by the FSH and LH, the estrogen and progesterone causes changes in the endometrial part of the uterus, so that these two cycles get coordinated. Right. Now, if there's pregnancy, the placenta grows out of the endometrium. If there's none, then the endometrium matures and then is sloughed off, and that's what menstruation is, and menstrual bleeding. The vaginal canal is the birth canal. It has some spaces in front and behind the cervix called the fornix, the anterior fornix and the posterior fornix, so together the fornices. They have the rugae, and for a short while there's a hymen. There are lactobacillus that live in here, and they maintain the environment of they maintain an acidic environment in the vagina that keep the vagina clean. One of the unfortunate things is that antibiotic therapies will kill these lactobacillus and make people prone to yeast infections. The semen that's being produced by the seminal vesicles and the prostate is very alkaline because the vagina is very acidic. So they cancel each other out temporarily. So the external genitalia, female external genitalia, is the labia majora and the labia minora. So the labia majora is analogous to the scrotum. It's basically the exact same tissue as the scrotum that holds the testicles, except there's no testicles in them, so it's filled with fat. The labia minora is a hairless skin that is analogous to the shaft of the penis. If you were to take the two labia minora and join them together and make a tube, it would be like a penis. The clitoris sits up at the top, and it actually, the crus of the clitoris extend down on both sides of the vagina. It's like a turkey wishbone. The clitoris is analogous to the penis, except it's a lot smaller. But it has the same number of nerve endings, so it's way more sensitive. Now, the area between the labia minora is called the vestibule. And the vestibule is the entryway. The urethra opens up into the vestibule, and there are two glands called Bartholin's glands that are mucus secreting glands, also open up into the vestibule. And their job is to produce mucus to provide lubrication. The walls of the vagina itself are stratified squamous epithelium, so they can't produce mucus. Okay. And then the opening to the vagina. Okay, so the cycles, there's the ovarian cycle and there's the uterine cycle, the menstrual cycle. And these two things have to be coordinated. So in the ovarian cycle, we start out with primordial follicles that get stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone. So the follicle stimulating hormone goes up, it starts this development. The follicle stimulating hormone means that the follicles become primary follicles and then secondary follicles, and they're producing estrogen. So estrogen levels go up. By the time we get to the Graafian follicles, the estrogen levels are very high. Now, the estrogen causes the endometrium of the uterus to grow. We call this the proliferative phase because the cells are proliferating, and the endometrium gets thicker and thicker. Right? At this time, progesterone is low because there's no production of progesterone. The FSH goes down because it's being inhibited by the estrogen. The luteinizing hormone is low because it's being inhibited by the estrogen. all of a sudden estrogen levels get so high that they stop having negative feedback. Huge amounts of luteinizing hormone are released, as is estrogen, which causes ovulation. The ovulation happens, and then the granulosal cells start to become the corpus luteum because of the luteinizing hormone, and they start producing progesterone. So progesterone levels go up. Estrogen levels start to go back up again, which inhibits the LH and FSH, so they go down. And the progesterone causes the uterus, the endometrial tissue, to start secreting the nutrients that the ova and the sperm need. So we'll call this the secretory phase. So the proliferative phase is it growing, then the secretory phase is it secreting. Now, if there's no pregnancy, the corpus luteum disintegrates to the corpus albicans, progesterone levels drop, estrogen levels drop, okay? And the FSH and LH are low. And when all these hormones are low, especially the estrogen and progesterone, now the endometrium is no longer being supported to secrete or to proliferate. So it starts to die and fall off. And this is menstruation. And then the cycle starts again. So we time the menstrual cycle starting at the beginning of menstruation. So day 0 to 4 is the menstrual phase. Then 4 to 14 is the proliferative stage. Ovulation, if it happens at day 14, happens, and then the endometrium moves into the secretory phase until the estrogen and progesterone levels drop, in which case then we start the menstrual phase again at day 28. Now, these days are just averages. Don't worry about, like, they vary with individuals, but okay. Okay, so without a fertilized ova, without pregnancy, then the corpus luteum dies and becomes scar tissue, corpus albicans. The levels of the ovarian hormones go down because they're not being made. And then the endometrial lining comes off and menstruation happens. If there is a fertilized ova, then what happens is the ova itself secretes chorionic gonadotropin, which causes the corpus luteum to be maintained. And then the hormones, the estrogen and progesterone, maintain the uterine lining, and we don't have menstruation. We have more secretion in and the endometrium stays whole. Okay. So estrogen and progesterone levels stay high as the result of pregnancy. And the other result of that is that the estrogen and progesterone levels keep on inhibiting the release of FSH. And so you have no more stimulation of follicles so that you don't get pregnant again. And this is what we use for the birth control pill. By maintaining the estrogen and progesterone levels through the pill, we inhibit the FSH, which means follicles don't develop, no ovulation, and therefore no pregnancy. Okay, so this takes a little while to establish. So when you reach puberty, these things all start. We call it the menarche, the first menstrual bleeding. As you age, estrogen levels rise, but they don't actually become their fullest until you're in your 30s, and then they start to decline. Now, as they're declining, we call that time perimenopause, around the time, and these are declining levels of estrogen. There's body changes, there's mood changes, there's things that change during that time. Menopause is when you've now run out of follicles, and so the cycle completely stops, and estrogen levels go way down. And we'll just leave it at that. Now, at the same time, all this is going on, one of the secondary characteristics is breasts. So the mammary glands really are modified sweat glands, and they're mostly fat. Most of the time, they're simply decorative. But when you're pregnant, then what starts to happen is the glands develop. Prolactin causes these to be stimulated to start producing milk. The milk goes through these ducts to the nipple, and lactation happens. The breasts are suspended by ligaments on the fascia overlying the pectoral muscles. Now, as the breasts grow and get heavy, those suspensory ligaments can stretch and change. Gravity is not usually very friendly to that over time. So prolactin is huge. It causes the production of milk. Right? So estrogen and progesterone prepare that. Oxytocin is what stimulates the release of milk. So those are the hormones involved. So there's this thing called the milk letdown reflex. So the baby actually suckling causes the pituitary gland to release oxytocin, and oxytocin makes the breasts smooth muscle contract and expel the milk. So there's a feedback system where suckling causes oxytocin, oxytocin causes release of milk, which causes more suckling, which, until the baby stops feeding. Okay. Okay. A quick look at meiosis. So in meiosis, we want the number of chromosomes to half from 46, which is 2n, to 23, which is the number of pairs. That's why it's 23 in me. And in meiosis, there's two rounds of cell division, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. And what happens is we end up with 4 daughter nuclei. Now, they're not all used. In men, all 4 become sperm cells. In women, only 1 becomes the ova. The other 3 are just lost. They're not used. How come that's not working? Let's try that. Okay, so what happens here is prophase of meiosis 1 is exactly the same as prophase in mitosis. The prophase, the chromosomes condense, the nuclear envelope disappears. Now, in mitosis, metaphase, all 46 chromosomes line up on the midline. What happens in metaphase 1 of meiosis is that the pairs of chromosomes line up on the midline. In mitosis, anaphase, each chromosome is pulled apart, so the two halves of each chromosome end up on other side, and then they end up forming new nuclei in telophase. So we're following the same thing. The only difference is that metaphase 1, it's the pairs that have lined up instead of the individual chromosomes. At anaphase 1, the pairs get separated. At telophase 1, we are now have created two nuclei with each with one half of the pairs. So then we enter prophase 2, where the nuclear envelope, the new nuclear envelope disappears. Then in metaphase 2, the chromosomes line up in the middle. Anaphase 2, they pull apart, so each half of the chromosome ends up separate. And then telophase 2, we end up with these 4 nuclei, each with a haploid number of chromosomes. Okay, so we end up with 4 haploid daughter cells. And like I say, in sperm production, all 4 get used because there's no cytoplasm necessary for a sperm cell. In the oocytes, in the eggs, the egg needs the cytoplasm, it needs the organelles. And so, therefore, only one of the 4 nuclei is retained, and the others are thrown off as what are called polar bodies, and they just disintegrate. They're not used. So, but it's random which one of the 4 ends up being used. And you can imagine that the pairs in being separated in meiosis 1 is also random. So it's like shuffling cards. It's random. So, and it very seldom ever happens the same way twice. And so we can end up with genetic variation. This is happening in your father's sperm and your mother's egg, and then the new individual is some brand new unique combination of chromosomes that has never existed before. And it all happens because of meiosis, turning the 2N diploid chromosome numbers, 46, 23 pairs, into the haploid number, 23, one half of each pair. Okay, so that's it for the reproductive system. We will see you next week.